Welcome to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from Devious Group Research. I'm Taimur Baig, Chief Economist, welcoming you to our 133rd episode. Today, we will touch on demographics, a topic that has deep implications for economic growth, financial market outlook, and social stability. Our guest is Jennifer Sciubba, an expert on the field of political demography. She recently became the president and CEO of Population Reference Bureau. She also has affiliations with the Wilson Center and Hess Center for New Frontiers at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Her latest book, 8 Billion and Counting, How Sex, Death, and Migration Shape Our World. Jennifer, a warm welcome to Kopi Time.
Thank you very much for having me.
And welcome back to Singapore.
Yes, it is as busy as always, I think.
That's right. You were here, I believe, about 14, 15 years ago.
Yes.
And what brings you to Singapore?
I spoke yesterday at the Singapore Council on Women's Organizations' first annual Summit for Action on Gender Equality, which is, I argued that we need to look at our population issues through a gendered lens, and we'll ask different questions than we might otherwise ask and get different answers. So I think it sheds a lot of light on what's happening with demographic dynamics, particularly in Asia.
Fantastic. I don't think the intersection of gender and demographics are fully appreciated, so I'm glad you're taking a stab at that.
Yeah, and you think it would be, because, biology, and yet somehow it is not really on the radar of policymakers.
That's right. Great. So, Jennifer, want to take advantage of your experience and expertise on demographics as much as I can today, but I want to start with a couple of technical questions. Sure. So, when I look at UN National Prospects Database, fantastic database, great website, I use it all the time, but it's not just one forecast for population. There are probability bands around population projections, then there are variants, low, medium, high, constant fertility variant, instant replacement fertility. Can you break down these various measures of demographic projections for us?
Sure. So, when you're thinking about how to approach the variants, you want to think about how are you going to use them. So there's different uses for different ones. I'm a huge fan of the constant fertility variant. It says if everything stays the way that it is right now, what does the future look like? And this is what I love about demography. I'm sorry that you're an economist because you don't know what's happening tomorrow, but I do.
That's right.
It's a real privilege to be able to look out into the future, many years in the future, and have a sense of what it will be, because so many of the people of the future are already born. So the constant fertility variant is useful when we want to say if everything stayed the same, how does the future look? So if you want to prepare for that type of future, then you can do so. And then as you start tweaking those underlying numbers, that's where you get this rainbow of projections. So, the UN actually has hundreds of projections just by tweaking those underlying variants. Most people use the medium, and it is the one that the UN would say is the most likely to happen. Mm-hmm. It is made with a mathematical model, and it's based on the past. So how do we use the past to inform the future? It's not my favorite, though, because my background is actually politics and political science. And I'm not sure that failing to contextualize the economic, political, and social variables is really the way to think about the future.
I think I want to call this podcast Contextualizing Demography.
There you go.
And I think you want to revisit this issue over and over again. I think I also am persuaded by the constant fertility matter, and I really found resonance in it when I saw your TED Talk, where you had these projections that this country's population go down by 40% by the end of the century if we go with the constant variant, constant fertility variant. Mm-hmm. And then, to your point, you can start preparing, or if you don't like that outcome,
maybe you can change it.
There are some policy implications.
And I think it's really important if you are someone who actually uses these projections in your work to make a difference, as economists might do, to understand how those assumptions are tweaked for the future. And there have been some things that I would really disagree with. So if we look, for example, at the difference between the medium and the constant fertility for countries like Nigeria or Tanzania, just over the next, 16 years, just out to 2040, it makes a dramatic difference in the total number of people. I think it's something like The constant fertility variant versus the median for Nigeria, I think, is a child and a half different. Wow. That would be, now think about Singapore's total fertility rate is less than one child. So this is a huge difference. And so there are these assumptions that you can tweak that say, do you expect fertility rates to go up where they are currently low? And historically, the UN has put that in there. And do you expect them to come down where they're high?
Correct. Okay, if I were to travel back in time to your last visit to Singapore, so 2010, 2011, and we opened up UN Population Prospect. Probably it was not as elegant a website then as it is now.
No, it was such easier to use though.
and we looked at the forecast sitting at 2011, mm-hmm. and we looked at the forecast for 2024. How spot on would those forecasts would have been?
What I remember the most was how optimistic they were. So they were optimistic in two ways. I've always been a Japan watcher, and I remember noticing how the expectation was that Japan's total fertility rate would rise in the future. Well, that certainly has not happened. In fact, most of these rates have gone lower. And I think there was a sense that surely it can't stay this low for this long. So they thought it would go up, and then there was also an expectation that it would come down faster, basically in a handful of sub-Saharan African countries where it's still high, because it really fell fast in most parts of the world. But there have been a handful of countries where it has remained high. Some demographers call it a fertility stall. I mean, that in and of itself shows that there's a bias towards assuming a rapid decline. But they were also overly optimistic about how quickly those rates would fall.
So the 8 billion mark that is looming would have been at a different point in time substantially.
It wasn't really, because actually they kind of canceled each other out. So, we knew it was 12 to 13 years, roughly in there, which is, pretty close.
I use a lot of these data for my work here at DBS, and as you can imagine, as an aging society in Singapore, this issue is very close to our heart. One question that I sometimes confront is the forecasts on India versus Japan, China versus US. Are they all comparable? Are all countries producing decently comparable data?
Well, no, not necessarily. And there are multiple groups who actually put out population projections. So Population Reference Bureau does one as well. We have our World Population Data Sheet, which we put out for about 60 years, comes out in September, most years. And our demographers do their own sorts of projections. And so there are a lot of sources of data. If you were to open up, for example, the methodology for Afghanistan, so how does the UN actually know what's happening in Afghanistan? We know that this is there's a lot happening in this country, so how are you supposed to figure out where the population is? You'd have 2 paragraphs of them of pulling together data sources. USAID funds a series of demographic and health surveys, the DHS. That's a really solid source for inputs into these projections. But sometimes there's also a little bit of picking up the phone and calling other demographers and experts in these countries and these regions to say, here's what the numbers say, what do you think about these? So there's a bit of a human touch in there outside of that median variant that I think is actually very useful.
But just to...
Yeah, so look, the sources will be somewhat different, but they're going through the same filter. So in my mind, I'm comfortable enough saying that they're comparable.
Sure.
And that it's the filter part that matters.
Right. And are there ways of sort of triangulating the data? So you bring me demographics data, I bring you tax collection data.
Yeah.
And we can see that if a country's projection is huge pickup in the labor force and the country's saying there's lots of people working, we should be seeing that in other.
Yeah, and some of that happens as well, and they pull from all kinds of different record keeping. The hardest part is the migration piece, because by definition, these people are on the move. So there's a lot of guessing that goes into the migration part as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Jennifer, I was in Cambodia recently, and they sort of talk about the killing fields in the 70s and how life expectancy collapsed there, I think to 23 or 24 there. It's come back amazingly well over the last 40 years, so that kind of reflects the resiliency of society, that a demographic shock need not be fatal, that there are ways to rejuvenate. Right. But also it sort of brings me to this question that, what are the shocks that alter demographic trends? Did the pandemic change demographic in the world?
Not really. So obviously, for the people who died and their families, it was very much a shock. But when we're talking about in these aggregate numbers, it didn't. in fact, I think already that's kind of worked its way out of the data. In some part, it's because many of the deaths were to people who were already finished with their reproductive years. But even for fertility rates, they basically went to where they were before. And in the U.S., I've always talked about it as it just pushed on the gas pedal directions we were already headed. So maybe you saw a little bit of an acceleration. Life expectancy in the U.S. was already on the decline,
That's right.
which is insane, by the way. It should not.
For a wealthy industrial society, yeah.
Well, even generally, unless absent a giant war, it is absolutely insane that it would be going down. And so it just pushed on the gas pedal a little bit. Fertility trends already headed down. Maybe you push on the gas pedal a little bit. And most demographers would say that people who were going to have babies, they might have delayed a little bit and then picked right back up.
What about the pandemic bump? People were all staying at home and not working. Yeah. Didn't they have lots of babies?
No, not this time. Yeah, and like some of the data we've seen about even power outages in the past, and then right. you can kind of trace a bump. No.
Fascinating. So it seems to me that we have pretty powerful trends in motion, and we have seen policy experiments here and there around the world, and so far, the power of the trend seems to be overwhelming to a large extent. I'm going to come back to that because I want to talk a little bit about the issue related to Scandinavia and so on. But just drivers of fertility. I know it's a big subject,
yeah.
And I'm sure you get lots of questions on that. So let's talk about what drives fertility rates.
It is a lot of things, which actually is what frustrates policymakers. And I'm sympathetic to that because as an academic, the best study is when you can say, what are the most powerful explanatory variables here? And then if you're a policymaker, you can take that research and you say, well, let's put a policy in place to address this. And voila, problem solved. But that's not really how these decisions are made. And I think anyone who has considered having children knows exactly what we mean when we say that it's complicated. It's never just about the money or the timing. It's so many things. But if you think about fertility rates as a big old pot of soup, there are a few different ingredients that go in and that are pretty standard. So modernization matters, and modernization can be a whole host of variables like education rates for women. So if you're talking about a country where fertility rates are very high, let's say 5, 6 children per woman, and you bring in educational system where women especially make it to secondary school, you're going to see those rates fall. Also in modernization, incomes are rising. So opportunity cost goes up, more opportunities to earn income outside the home. All of that kind of comes in together there. More robust health systems, access to family planning. And so that is one driver. You also have government policy, and it's hard to analytically separate some of these because the government policy will often be, let's put in schools or put in health clinics. But with modernization, I like to think of it as processes that are in motion that the government may or may not have put in motion itself. But government policy can change the trajectory of trends, as we know. Think about China and India, many other places. And then there's the family planning piece. And it really is, it's often left out of discussions, which I find puzzling, but just the technology of being able to decide how many children to have and when is really powerful.
I bring this up with some degree of trepidation and hesitation because this is a podcast on numbers and trends and policy, but let me go there anyway. Last week there was an article, came from Apple News, I can't remember the source, but it was that there is also something beyond all these macroeconomic, societal factors. There is this question of purpose, that there is a generational shift on sense of purpose, and people feel that between climate change and geopolitics, they're not hopeful about the future, and maybe that plays a role. It's hard to put a finger on it, but what's your thought on that?
I think absolutely yes. And if I'm trying to keep it simple, I kind of stick it under the modernization umbrella, but it is different. And it's funny because, now that I'm the CEO of PRB, the first time I ever learned about the Population Reference Bureau was to attend, this was well over 20 years ago, I guess, but it was to attend a seminar that was trying to explain why fertility rates were so low in Eastern Europe. And I'll never forget it because they talked about all these same kind of variables we mentioned, and they said, really, there's just people feel so dismal about the future. And we do see echoes of that today, especially anecdotally, you speak to a young person, they talk about that all the time. That is some of it, but as far as how do we know for sure if that will shape fertility behavior, we don't know yet. And that's because these young people have not completed their fertility.
That's right.
And so there are some papers that I've seen that say, yeah, they may feel this way, but we all know you have a certain set of way you think the world works in your 20, you're 25. And then you think a lot differently about the world later. So we will not know. We have to do this again in 10 years to say, did it actually drive people's fertility behavior lower?
Makes me a little sad because I'd like to think the optimism should be at the younger age spectrum and the midlife crisis and everything should be later.
Yeah.
But it's like we're hoping that it's almost the opposite now. You're starting out kind of jaded about the future, and then hopefully as you make money, as you get gainful employment, you get more purpose.
Well, and I think we're caught in this echo chamber because think about the type of news that comes in our phones. It's all bad and it's right there. It's in our faces all day long. And for young people, that's all they're surrounded by. Whereas we didn't grow up with that type of flow of information. And there are, I was speaking to a group of young people, actually young people in Asia the other night in the US, and I said to them, you know, there are places where you can read good news. Angus Hervey, who is out of Australia, I think, he was at TED the same time I was, and he has, his whole shtick is, here's the good news. And it's real news, it's evidence-based, and it's actually showing what has happened. Hannah Ritchie was also at TED the same year as I was, and she talks about environment. And she had a book out, what year? It's earlier this year, I think, as well. And she says, these are all the things that have gotten better, but that is like a grain of sand on a beach.
Come back to the issue of modernization. The theory has been that when you look at a country like Sweden or Norway, once you become very wealthy, then people start behaving a little differently because there are so many safety nets in place and they then do have babies. I would have thought some of that would play out in Japan. That hasn't happened. So not quite a convincing argument?
Well, I think we moved the bar on ourselves. You know, when I feel very fortunate. I think mine was like the last cohort of people who could basically buy houses in our early 20s before things started to get out of control. But even the expectations that younger people have today for what they want to achieve before they have children, it has really moved up. And I think, I mean, we could go down a rabbit hole about technology I do keep coming back to. I remember when my kids were very young was when Instagram was really starting. And the only messages you'd get about parenting basically were how hard it was, or the perfect mom who was throwing the perfect party that probably costs $500. Well, neither of those things is very attractive when you're thinking about having children. You're thinking just really about how incredibly expensive it is. And so a lot of the people I was speaking with actually yesterday at this summit were saying how the competition for like who can just be better, more educated, have a higher income, it's really spiraled up, and this puts a downward pressure on fertility itself.
Correct. Okay, this is a medical science question. I really don't know if there's an answer to this question, but just from a women's health perspective, are women today as fertile? I know it's complicated because there's a choice issue there, but just from a biological perspective?
Well, they're waiting later. So, and that is just very simple stats. You know, people are marrying later, and then they're waiting later to have their first child. And when, you know, sitting in Asia, where, most children are born within a marriage, that means that marriage becomes an incredibly important first step before you have children. So if people are waiting later to get married, then they are starting their families later. And so we do see a lot more women of older ages seeking assisted reproductive technology. And those, we see that around the world. I mean, in the US, for example, the only age group I think that was seeing an increase in births was 40 to 45. But that's because they were waiting later.
Right. So it's not health, but health technology and choice.
Yes, I think so. Now, this is, there are other people who have said that it's infertility. I don't buy it because if you study data just on preferences, you see that preferences shifted.
Correct. That's probably the most powerful one. So let's talk about Japan a little bit. Sure. Japan has had a demographic time bomb ticking away for the last several decades, and we see stories of villages getting depopulated, the country being forced to embrace certain aspects of immigration that Japan was not really open to in the past. this is the bad stuff. But at the same time, when I look at Japan's economic performance over the last 20, 30 years, while we say that it's been a lost decade, but because they've had basically zero or negative population growth rate, their per capita income has gone up. So the Japanese who are around are significantly more prosperous today than they were, while just looking at the demographic story, it looks like a bad story. So how do we net this out?
I think we had nothing but wild guesses about what aging would look like and its effects on the economy. Now, other people would say they're not wild guesses. They're based in all these economic theories about productivity and labor and all of that. But we didn't know because we've never in human history had this type of demographic shift. So we took our logic from the past, which, by the way, this logic was made at a time when population growth seemed like it would be infinite. So all of our economic theories, all of our cases have to do with that. And when we kind of say, well, it must be different in the future. I think we also have applied what we know about individual aging to populations, that you lose your capacity to be innovative, you have cognitive decline, you'll be less of a risk taker, you're tired and not productive. And we put all of that on what population aging would look like and what it would do to the economy. And so now we were surprised that that didn't necessarily happen. I think in Japan's case, if anybody was going to go first, I'm glad they went first. Because they do show what's possible. And I really mean that I'm glad that they went first, because imagine a country, I'm not going to name any other country names here, but imagine a country where technology was not so robust, or the population wasn't so educated, or even consumption patterns, or views on older people. All of these things together made it a great case to say, look what's possible. I think I saw some statistic that something like half of Japanese firms still use workers who are over the age of 70.
Right.
So these are things that I don't think we really thoroughly accounted for when we were making our predictions of the future.
We just assume over 65, retired.
Done.
Zero productivity.
That's why I would never use dependency ratio. I mean, I guess when I first started, I used it, and I quickly threw it out and said, I will never use this as a measure, because you can't compare Greece with Japan in terms of dependency ratio. It's not that there's a magical number you become a dependent.
Right. There's like 5-6 years difference. And the official retirement age has got more de facto.
Yes. And I don't even use official retirement age either. I think about what's the effective retirement age. Yeah.
Right. But one bottom line would be that you should be rich before you get old, from a societal perspective?
See, I will say we don't know. What is the should part? So here's how I think about population aging. There are always winners and losers. The winners and losers will be different in different settings. Let's say, for example, if you are a poor country, and there's population aging, the losers will be the families and the older people themselves, who really might not have the resources to go around. Is it going to bankrupt the government budget? Maybe not. Maybe they are the winners because they never put in place those systems in the first place, versus maybe a European-style welfare state where there are all these extensive promises to the population. Well, the winners and losers might look different there. So it's really all about those trade-offs.
All right, that's fantastic. I'm glad you brought that up. It's hard to talk about demographic trends without one corollary of demographic trend, which is migration. For opportunities, for push factors, people move around. So when you think about demographics and dealing with demographic trends, aging, for example, how do you contextualize migration?
Most of the time when I get questions from, there's always a question from the audience on migration, and there's always an assumption that the flows of the future will be huge. I think everywhere I go, it is, look what's to come. When several years ago, when people started paying more and more attention to climate change, look how many people will be displaced. The flows will be huge. I don't think that at all. Doesn't mean people won't need to migrate or won't want to migrate, but I don't think that they will be able to migrate. I don't see any, if I do a temperature check around the world, there's nothing that tells me, here they come. And in fact, speaking of winners and losers, people who will be displaced and maybe need to move, they will be the losers in this case. I see nothing but borders. And actually, as I think, put it in conversation with low fertility. So these low fertility, high migration societies, there's a lot of discussion and conflict about the right mix of migrants. And I know that in Asia, there's a lot of discussion, particularly in Korea and Japan, about what role will migration play in the future in compensating for those labor force losses? And most of the time I hear people talk about Europe and say, I'm not really sure we actually want to go in that direction. Is there another way to do it? I think most people do not realize that 96% of the world's population still lives in the country in which they were born. And I think the reason that it gets so wrong in the popular media is that the elite in the world, they have moved. Yeah. You know, we're in Singapore right now. This is a group of people whose bias would be thinking everybody moves. I've given a talk in Silicon Valley. I always ask this question. I mean, spoiler alert, if I come give a talk for anybody who's listening, I'll say, pop quiz, what proportion of the world's population lives outside of the country in which they're born? And in Silicon Valley, they're like, 50%. And I said, yeah, that's because you all moved. Yes. You know, but it's way lower. So it's been, 2 or 3% for decades. I think there will be reasons for people to move, but labor does not flow like capital, that's for sure.
Of course. I also think that some of the migration of people might be supplanted by migration of robots going forward. I had this discussion, Jennifer, a couple of years ago. I was at USC, and we were talking about economic future of the world, but in the context of China, we talked about aging and what that means for China. And there were a couple of Chinese nationals in the audience, and they came to talk to me after, and they said, you do want to talk about China in the context of automation and robotization, because we are very much cognizant of the fact that our labor force is not what it used to be, and we will embrace automation as enthusiastically, if not more than anybody else. Oh,
yeah. I believe that to be the case. I'd be curious. I'm going to kind of throw this back to you a little bit. When I think about automation and aging, I tend to think that if it displaces some high-skilled workers, that's probably good, actually, since there'll be fewer in the future. Where I get uncomfortable is if it displaces low-skilled workers in low-income contexts, then we are in a different space.
Right. I mean, what I would like to hope for is that a highly automated future actually increases the work potential of the low or the high-skilled people, that they can harness those robots and do more stuff as opposed to being fully replaced by the robots. That a future should be characterized by even more capabilities and more options for us to do things, not like, just that one thing that was done by a human being would be done by a robot. Yeah. Why can't we have a multiplicity around that? Yeah. But that might be a techno-optimistic.
But I'm the same way too. I mostly am optimistic. And when I look at demographic trends, goodness, look at life expectancy. We've added a whole nother life to people. And if it is the case that it gives us better well-being in the future, that's wonderful. And kind of marry this with what we know about younger generations today and their feelings about work. They really prioritize well-being. So I'm not sure they're willing to work the same number of hours. So perhaps it will be a perfect marriage.
Correct. So what is your sense of your conversations with policymakers around the world, like government of Singapore or governments in the US or elsewhere? How are governments dealing with these extremely powerful, almost overwhelming shifts in demographic trends?
No matter where I am, there's one important thing in common. They just want to put the genie back in the bottle. And that means, how do we get more babies? Uh-huh. Now, even Singapore, which I am a huge admirer of, and I think incredibly innovative. Again, if anybody has to go through these types of things first, great for Singapore to do it because we can see what will happen. But the general conversation everywhere is, tell us, what's the secret? What's the secret to more babies? There is no secret. And if I could have anyone, if we could change anything, it would be accept this and move towards resilience. The first country that does that and starts planning for resilient society, speaking of winners and losers, that put all your eggs in that basket. That's the place to follow. So I keep looking for signs that someone gets it and they've moved past it and they're just thinking about, retirement, work, health, and all of those things. Singapore possibly comes the closest to that. There's a lot of discussion about health span versus lifespan, about wealth span as well. And so I see little bits of murmurings there, but I think we're already behind.
I became a citizen of Singapore earlier this year, and immediately I was given access to certain facilities like SG Health, where the idea is that the health span issue, that having a single general practitioner attached to you who has your records, or if you go to a different doctor, the records digitally go to the other doctor, and there's a continuous case record, and the focus is on preventative care as opposed to spending a lot of money on hospitalization. So I think that's one sensible approach to dealing with a population that will be increasingly older going forward.
Absolutely, and I really do think that Singapore is pretty much the one place that is, and it helps it's small, because you can have lots of experiments here.
Correct.
Small, well-educated, and innovative. And so, if you're going to have resilience, that's perfect.
Let's jump outside of Singapore a little bit and go to the rest of Southeast Asia. What's your sense? I mean, the one story that we always talk about in this region is Thailand, which is not a high-income economy, but displaying advanced economy type demographic dynamic.
Yeah. Well, I know. It's really, I'm also curious about Thailand. So again, my whole career I've heard, and it was always spoken about in China, old before rich, old before rich. And so I've always tried to think, why? What does that actually matter? Is it about household savings and income security in old age? Well, how could we offset that if there's a really strong, family support there? Is it about the types of jobs that people will have? So I don't know if I think the total fertility rate there is like Singapore, 1 child per woman. I don't know if I buy that all of these countries that are seeing these demographic trends before they're rich are doomed. What do you think I'm missing?
No, I think you make a very good point. I think the view is from a very traditional growth model.
Yeah.
You need a certain amount of money and certain amount of people to get certain amount of growth, assuming productivity is sort of constant. Around that, if you have less number of people, you'll get less growth. Less growth is like the biggest disaster economies can think of, and therefore, you're doomed. And so do you need immigration, or do you need to have ways to encourage women to have more babies, that sort of stuff. But I think that given your train of thought, I'm sort of persuaded by the point that you don't necessarily think about pushing back against a very overwhelming dynamic. It's a bit like climate change. I mean, we can take a lot of mitigating measures, but we basically have to deal with a world that will be warmer tomorrow than it is today, and today is already warmer than yesterday. Similarly with aging, I think that, again, I think you made a very good point with respect to Japan. We probably were optimistic about Japan's demographic trend 20 years ago than what has turned out to be, and might as well then have a very conservative approach instead of being overly optimistic about it. So plan with the view that fertility rates don't change, and then see what are the opportunities around that.
I think I use the climate change all the time to say, let's try to stop the warming of the world. But you're not just going to sit there on your front porch with the water lapping around your ankles and think, well, how do we stop the world from warming? You're going to try to put your house up on stilts. And so this adaptation and resilience is exactly how we need. And now, can I ask you about growth, though? I come at this from an environmental studies perspective, actually. And when I look at we've already got 50 shrinking countries, I think. So this is already happening. We're already there. And yet I don't see anything changing in the conversation about a bias towards growth, a fetish of growth, actually. What would it take, or is it impossible, for us to move away from thinking that the ultimate marker of success is positive growth, even as a country's population is shrinking?
It's hard. It's easy to just stay fixated on national accounts-based GDP numbers, which is not a very old construct. It basically began after the Second World War, when we had the whole war economies, input, output, and national accounts made sense. This much capital, this much labor, this is the amount of value that we're creating. We haven't gotten out of it. We as economists are culpable of not being able to inform the world that there are better ways of looking at prosperity, social welfare, well-being. So for me, for example, Singapore's biggest achievement is not a very high per capita income, but the fact that it has one of the highest life expectancies in the world, that its population has some of the highest education attainments in the world. So I would love for us to look at it from a multidimensional perspective. But I think policymakers find it easier to deal with a dollar amount, and that being a proxy for success, achievement. Very hard to get out of that. And so I'm not going to say that there is some bright, new, shining field of economics that's going to change the way we look at it. Nobel laureate Amartya Sen and Joe Stiglitz a few years ago, maybe about 10, 12 years ago, wanted to sort of, break forth alternative measures of GDP, different ways of looking at it. It was an interesting thought experiment, didn't really go anywhere. I think for the remainder of our mutual professional careers, we'll have to deal with the point that if population shrinks, growth goes down, and that's the worst of all.
Worst of all. And it's a shame. I really do think yeah, maybe in the future. But I do find the same thing when I talk to people in the private sector about what does it look like to scale down, and the eyes just bug out, and you be at the airport, and what is on the screen behind you? What does consumer spending look like? And it's just all of these markers that we expect. And I do find that it connects actually with our views on the environment, because again, if you're measuring everything with spending or with growth, then that really conflicts with what we're trying to do environmentally as well.
So how do you reduce emission when you want to actually burn more electricity to run the Gen AI models that we want to use now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit easier with the environment actually than with aging, because you say, well, there's a huge, there's a lot of money to be made as we make these shifts towards greener things.
So that's one thing that, again, is close to my heart, because as a bank, we think about, what are the financial opportunities around an increasingly silver population, and what kind of financial engineering options you can give them so that whatever money they have, it can go longer than what we have thought was necessary even 10, 15 years ago. So that is something that I think banks, insurance companies, pension funds in Singapore, in the US, in Europe will keep on doing going forward, because going back to my immediate response to you, which is that the growth fetish is not going to go away. Yeah. So it's what it is. I am sure, Jennifer, that you get asked about China and its doomsday scenarios around aging all the time. How do you respond to those people who think that China is destined for really bad things because it's aging so rapidly?
Well, one thing I say is that China is not as surprised as you might think China is. So if you can read documents from 40 years ago where those in charge said, all right, if we put in place these policies that encourage or more than encourage lower births, in 40 years' time, we will be an aging society. So they knew that would happen. I think the surprise part is they thought they could reverse it. But they're not alone in that. What I tend to say is, I actually think that democracies will be, and this is like a hard thing democracies are way worse off when it comes to population aging. It gets back to this winners and losers thing. Right. The thing about demography that I said I love is that you can see the future. It requires, though, long-term planning. Are you in a political system that can long-term plan? I do not live in one. I live in one where before the election is over, you're already talking about the next election. So how do you long-term plan to deal with a shift in basically the center of gravity of your population? You cannot do it. You also have electoral penalties. Think about in France, when people took to the streets because they're trying to raise the blue-collar work, from 55 to 57 or 57 to 59. There are these huge penalties and checks on that. If you're in a system that is less responsive to pressures from the population and in a system that can plan longer term, I think you have an advantage there. So I do not see as much of a doomsday scenario as maybe other people do.
I remember in your TED Talk, you had this striking observation that in Romania, Ceausescu tried very hard to force people to have babies, and it led to rather dire outcomes where people just abandoned the children. They were all ending up in orphanages, and of course, very soon thereafter, again, fertility rate collapsed.
Yep.
So don't try to force it too much, because it doesn't really go anywhere. The other point you made in your TED Talk, and that will take us to India, is that while we think of India as this big tailwind characterized economy with lots of young people, actually the working age population of India has already peaked.
It's already peaked, yeah. And if you ask back to preferences, if you look at the data on what's the preferred fertility rate, it's even lower. I think last I saw was around 1.76, and then the overall fertility rate was at 2. So as soon as people can act on those preferences, it's going to keep going lower. Of course, I came up in a time where everyone was obsessed with the BRICS and thinking about this as the future. When we start looking at, is India the next China, which is a common question, and I'm doing this with a demographic lens, I really notice a difference in the human capital situation, particularly when it comes to women. And so education,
Absolutely.
and I think that's why is a gender lens useful? Again, when you have 1.4 billion people, that's a lot of women. And the most highly educated women have some of the lowest labor force participation rates. And so I don't see the same setting and backdrop to capitalize on, we call the demographic window of opportunity that I know you talk about all the time, to reap a demographic dividend. So my expectation would be you won't reap as high of a demographic dividend.
Absolutely. I mean, this issue is something that I've talked about a lot in recent years, which is India has to raise its female participation rate in the labor force. You would not get a demographic dividend if you, A, don't educate the young, and B, don't bring the women into the labor force. And these are two challenges that India still has not fully delivered on. Jennifer, attitude. So we talked about initially, policymakers and how they're thinking, but societal attitude toward aging. Are we becoming more respectful of people with gray hair? Are we, getting ready for a world where there'll be lots and lots of people over 65?
You're a banker. How much money is there to be made in trying to look like you're not old?
Oh, substantial. Substantial, yes.
Yeah. I don't see it happening anywhere. I mean, when you're really looking for it, we can pluck a few things out. Like, look at the grand influencers. Some of the modeling campaigns will change, and maybe your products change a bit. But I think there's still a huge fear of aging, and I don't see it changing.
So we're aging, but we're still ageist.
Yeah, we absolutely are.
Yeah. So just as a bottom line, that we have powerful demographic forces. We're not fully ready to embrace the fact that it's heading in that direction. We still think that a policy tweak here or a middle income provision there takes us there. So then why do you remain somewhat constructive or optimistic about the future?
That is a very good question. I think that being a student of history and being so macro and generalist is what makes me optimistic. Because when you zoom out and think about where we were just a few decades ago, we're so much better off. So let's just think about health and life expectancy. That's the one everyone knows, of course. What we'll see all the time, cancer rates are on the rise and all that. Well, some of that's because we're actually living long enough to be able to get cancer. Right. So you have to die of something. So the shift to non-communicable diseases, though, is fantastic. That's a marker of success. You don't want people to die prematurely of them, but overall it's a good thing. And I actually think the same about fertility rates as well, with a really important caveat. So worldwide, 2 out of 3 people on this planet of 8 billion now live somewhere with below replacement fertility rates. They're able to do so in part because they know that if they have a fewer number of children, they're going to live to reproductive ages. So that is a vote, actually, of confidence in the future in one sense. And so, fertility behavior is an example of that. And here's the caveat, though. If you just told me about a society, you didn't tell me the name of the country or anything like that, and you said, this is a country and the total fertility rate is 6. What do you know about it? I would say there are a lot of things that are really broken in that society. They probably have very low female educational attainment. They probably have rampant child marriage, poor health outcomes, and probably an unstable government. Yeah. And they're poor. If you tell me that a country has a fertility rate of around 1, I also think that that may be an indicator of some things about that society that are broken. And I think it goes beyond, but it's part of it, what you said about optimism for the future. I think there is pessimism for the future there. And in those societies where it's really low, those gender relations tend to be really broken themselves. And so if you start looking at the household level, you see that it's very unequal. The amount of time that men and women spend on unpaid labor at home. And then women are often highly educated in these societies, and they are spending a lot of time in work. So I would say they're being asked to birth more, work more, and care more. And increasingly, they're saying no. Yeah. Just no. And you can get this from feminists in the region who will say, we're just going to opt out of this system completely. So, we think about reproduction is reproducing the system you're in. So if you're opting out of that, I think that says something about the society itself might not be serving their interests.
Right. That's like ultra-modern. You're basically saying no to the biological imperative.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a sober note to end on, but I really appreciate your insights. Jennifer, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
It was great to have you.
Appreciate it.
And thanks very much to our listeners as well. Kopi Time was produced by Ken Delbridge. Violet Lee and Daisy Sharma provided additional assistance. All 133 episodes of the podcast are available on YouTube, as well as on all major platforms, including Apple, Google, and Spotify. This podcast is for information only and does not constitute any investment advice. Have a great day.